What are fairy tales? Are they stories with which parents instruct their children in the ways of the world? Are they stories made to pass the time? Maybe they have the slightest bits of truth to them, having turned from history to fables. One thing is certain, and that is they have been told for generations. Each generation has heard their tales from the generation before, and this has been happening for hundreds, if not thousands of years. What if? What if they were real? What if they happened not so long ago, nor so very far away? I have worked tirelessly to collect these stories for you, transcribing letters, autobiographies, tracking down and interviewing loved ones of those deceased for their stories. I have braved the darkest of sewers, the slimiest bars. I have found myself at the highest of towers and hiding in the deepest gutters. I did all this because these stories must be shared, not for awareness' sake, nor for glory, but to bring down one man. I leave these stories to you in one book, in case I am brought down. The Book of Noire. May they be of use to you. When I was a young girl, I lived out in the country with my mama and papa. We had a happy life there, living on that little farm. We had a little blue Ford truck that I loved to ride in. I remember my papa cursing when he thought I couldn't hear him every time it backfired. I would always practice those curse words in front of my bedroom mirror whenever mama was too busy to play games. Quietly, of course. I never wanted to get into trouble. Mama's favorite pastime was reading, and whenever the chores had been done for the day, I remember she would curl up in the living room with a thick book, sitting in the white armchair by the front window. She had a bad habit of playing with the curtains while she read, and I remember there was a worn down and stained spot right next to that chair that she was never able to wash out. Of course, she never did admit her habit. Papa loved working the land, and he was good at it. Mama said he was gifted with a green thumb, and no matter the plant, he was able to get it to grow. He loved everything about that life. Well, almost everything. He always hated dealing with the banks. I remember one day, when I was 10, they sat me down in the living room of that house, Mama on her armchair and Papa on his favorite spot on the sofa. Both of them explained to me that Mama was pregnant, and that I'd have to be a big kid and help them take care of the kid. That I would be the best big sibling ever. When my brother was born, they let me help them pick out his name, and so Peter Piermont came into the world. Those were the good days, before the accident, before bad weather caused the farm to catch fire. Mama and Papa never made it out of the house. That was 4 years ago now, and I've moved on, mostly, quite literally in some cases. After the banks took back the farm, one of Papa's friends offered me a job in the city, working in a sweat house where myself and other women would sew fabric together for clothing. the materials brought in by men with big, bulky arms and deep-lined, worn faces. It paid enough to keep a roof over our heads, put food on the table. But no matter how much I brought in, it was never the same. I couldn't send Peter back to school, and though the workers we lived with helped to provide him with books, it wasn't the same, even with the boss's wife Nancy personally schooling all the children. And so my childhood passed me by, all too soon. A young woman forced to grow up after the untimely death of her parents, and though I was left to raise my brother, I wasn't alone. Papa's old friend, my very first boss, was a good boss, if not entirely a good man. He hated seeing his workers treated poorly. Other flat owners couldn't care less where their workers lived. As long as they came to work, they weren't worth the consideration in their eyes. Some nights, after the young children were put to sleep and the evening chores had been done, the older workers would tell horror stories of some companies abusing their workers, providing disease-ridden, vermin-infested hovels to live in. Work hours so long and gruesome, the weaker folk would waste away, until their bodies had to be pried away from their working stations. Women who went to work one day and just never came back, left to the tender mercies of their boss's goons. Whenever I heard those stories, those nightmares given flesh and bone, I'd look at my own situation. The tiny bedsitters with the cracked drywall, the apartments made for one family that housed instead 3. I'd see the clean floors, the constant rodent exterminations, the edible yet bland food. I'd look at it all and decide this wasn't so bad, even without Mama or Papa. And so life went, one day after the other. The same schedule stretched out to the span of years. The same sweater stitched together thousands of times. The same meals eaten, the same music played over the radio every evening. The same jokes and laughter from the men. Same concern and care from the women. Until one day, it was different. That day, a man walked right through the sweat house of Hamlin Sweaters and barged into Mr. Hamlin's office, quite unannounced. He was a skinny man, so skinny, it seemed, his suit would slip right off him anytime he moved. His nose hooked downward slightly, exaggerating his long, narrow face. What parts of his face that weren't blocked from sight by his long, greasy hair were pale, like he hardly spent more than a minute outside on any given day. He reminded me of a rat. He didn't spare any of us any pleasantries on the way up to the office. His only demand was for the presence of Mr. Hamlin himself. One of the younger men instantly split off to find the boss and tell him the situation, and another went to his office to keep an eye on the stranger. The rest of us stopped in our work, huddling in a large group near Grandma Emma's workplace. The grouchy old lady's face pinched in displeasure. She was the kind of old lady who was still living through this power of spite alone, despite, or rather because, of all that life had thrown at her. All that abuse left her strong, but terribly irritable. "Who's the stranger?" "Gives me the heebie-jeebies," Jessica shivered. She was Emma's granddaughter, her opposite in nearly every way. She was also my senior by 5 years. She just celebrated her 23rd birthday last week by hogging the radio the entire day. Her new obsession with a singer from a local club brought much amusement and exasperation among the workplace. Mr. Martin, a tall man with broad shoulders and long slicked hair, shrugged. He'd been a farmhand before money problems drove him to the city in search of work. He'd found both it and his wife Rebecca here. He was hired to move large, heavy boxes, but sometimes he'd pull security duty for the sweat house. He'd sometimes use some of the extra money to buy sweets for the kids. "I don't know, but I don't like him, coming in here like he owns the place," he drawled. Rebecca patted her husband's shoulder soothingly. "He was a little rude, I'll admit, but I don't think we should make any assumptions just yet. Maybe he's in a hurry, or he's had a bad day," she smiled. Grandma Emma snorted. "If he wasn't having a bad day before, he will be after I'm through with him. Coming in here and disrupting my work like this," she huffed, eyeing each and every one of them distastefully. "Old lady can't work with all you busybodies crowding her and worrying about Mr. Hamlin so vocally." Grandma Emma may have been a crabby old crone, but she was also obvious about how she really felt. Even then I remember having rolled my eyes. The old woman was the biggest gossip of us all. There was a reason we always crowded around her workplace, after all. Besides, she hadn't stitched a single thread since the man had so rudely announced himself. "If you're all so worried," she huffed in amusement, "have someone listen in on their conversation." Rebecca stepped forward, waving her hands. "Now wait just a darn minute. We can't just spy on Mr. Hemlin's meetings. We're not spying on Mr. Hemlin, Grandma Emma rolled her eyes. We're looking out for him by keeping an eye on the stranger, that's all. Rebecca's face of disbelief was rather funny at the time. It was decided that I would be the one to listen into the conversation. For one, I was rather short, so I could fit in the crawl space near Mr. Hamlin's office. For another, I was young enough to possibly get away with it if I got caught, but still old enough to understand what would potentially be said and relay it accurately to everyone else. It wasn't long after the little meeting before I found myself crawling through the little space next to the boss's office. Then I only had to wait for Mr. Hamlin to enter the room. I had to shift myself away from the walls, or risk being stuck by rusty nails. The floor was either dusty or grimy, depending on where water leaked through. It wasn't very comfortable. A ray of light spilled from a thin crack in the wall, the only lighting in the entire crawl space. He came into his office, displeasure and annoyance written all over him, like someone had given him bad milk in his breakfast. Mrs. Nancy slipped in the office behind him, catching the door and slipping it closed quietly. She quickly moved behind her husband, a quiet show of support. I thought I told your boss I wasn't interested in his little, charity deal? I couldn't see the stranger's face from my position, but I could hear the amusement saturating his voice. Mr. Wesser is a patient man, Mr. Hemlin. He gave you all that extra time to pay off your loan all those years ago. A debt I paid in full, Mr. Hemlin stressed. The stranger sighed heavily. Mr. Hemlin, have you ever heard the phrase, time is money? As a businessman, I'm sure you're at least familiar with the theory, if not the phrase itself. His voice dripped with sarcasm. Without letting him answer, the stranger continued on. Well then, you must understand that by allowing you all that time to pay back your debt, Mr. Wesser was, in fact, losing more money than he was gaining. Any low-rate money peddler would be able to tell you that it's just not productive to work like that. The man turned and paced the length of Mr. Hamlin's desk, hands scampering along the length of it as he walked. The business world would collapse if everyone just gave money away to whatever sob story walked up to them and asked for it. That is why, centuries ago, a brilliant man came up with the concept of interest. Mr. Wesser lends money to you, you pay him back over time with a little bit extra to make up for what he was lost by investing in you. This concept is not used by the entire banking world by chance, you know. Mrs. Nancy put her hand on her husband's shoulder comfortably, stopping the man from aggressively pacing. Instead, she turned to the stranger and looked him in the eye. How much do we supposedly owe? He didn't answer Mrs. Nancy. Instead, he reached into a briefcase on the desk, something I hadn't noticed until that moment. He withdrew a slim stack of papers, placed them on the desk, and slid them towards Mr. Hamlin. Nancy was the one to grab the papers, shuffling them and looking over the figures. The stranger's eyes narrowed in anger while Mrs. Nancy read the information. That can't be right, she looked up at her husband. You told me the interest rate was 15%. It is, he grabbed the papers, shuffling through them so fast they nearly ripped. His eyes bugged out and he glared back up at the stranger. What the hell is this? That would be a copy of the agreement you signed with Mr. Wesser, as well as the receipt of the debt you owe. The man's face was finally in a position where I could see his expression, which bore a heavy frown. Come now, Jonathan. Surely you recognize your own signature. The contract I signed was for 15% interest, all of which I paid off. This is over 40%. The stranger tutted. If you had read the fine print, you would have known that the 15% was only for the first year of the loan, to give you the opportunity to make full use of the asset Mr. Wesser provided you. Once the anniversary of the loan passed and your profits were secure, the interest rate had to be increased to 40 so that Mr. Wesser could begin to make back his own money. This is highway robbery. My boss's face was red with fury, veins popping out of his normally smooth skin, near bursting with heated blood. Mr. Wesser provided you every opportunity to read and understand everything in the agreement when it was made. You can't blame him for your own mistake, Mr. Hamlin. I can when that opportunity, as you called it, was shoved at me so suddenly in a room filled with hired goons with guns that could have filled me with holes faster than the police could crack down on a bar. If we start debating on the merits of hired protection in a town filled with crime, Mr. Wesser, this conversation will go nowhere. Mrs. Nancy stepped forward now, eyes on the stranger. How long do we have to pay back the interest this time? The man ignored her, instead turning to Mr. Hamlin. I came here to discuss business with you, Mr. Hemlin, not to have you cower behind the skirt of your wife. Now it was Mr. Hemlin who had to stop his wife from bursting in her anger. You should know that I always include Nancy in my business. Now answer her question. 1 year. Same agreement as last time. Mr. Hemlin shook his head. No can do. There's no way I would be able to make any profit, let alone even come close to paying back a ridiculous debt that size. I can do it in 2. I suppose Mr. Wesser will be amenable to extending the loan, but the interest rate will still apply. Mr. Hemlin threw up his hands in frustration. Then we'll just be going round and round in circles. The debt'll never be paid that way. He's more than made back the money he loaned me as it is. If you want to complain about how interest rates work, Mr. Hemlin, take it up with the banks who refused your loan in the first place. As it is, the debt needs paying. And I suppose I'll be earning money by growing dollar bills on trees. I won't ever be able to pay back the loan at the rate your boss wants. The stranger said, Mr. Wesser warned me this may be the way you reacted. He informed me that he would be willing to work an alternative form of payment. Mr. Hemlin froze, slowly putting the paper onto the desk. That was the first time I'd ever seen such a reaction from him. It chilled me to the core. What kind of payment? He asked slowly. The man paced behind the desk, standing behind Mr. Hemlin's chair and pulling the briefcase towards himself. He began to shuffle through the papers inside the briefcase, humming while doing so. Mr. Wesser has many forms of business ventures. Some of the more lucrative ones are, shall we say, frowned upon by the authorities. All Mr. Wesser can ask you to do is simply hold on to some of the merchandise while he prepares their transport. No, Mr. Hemlin snapped as soon as the man had finished talking, not even taking the time to think. I'm not going to become a peddler for his wares, or worse, his fall guy should the police catch wind of his illegal activities. The stranger smirked. Now, Mr. Hemlin, that's mighty hypocritical of you, wouldn't you say? From the briefcase emerged a manila folder, near bursting with papers inside, and held together with a string. The stranger threw it on the side of the desk closest to my boss, where it landed with a loud slap. And this is, Mrs. Nancy shifted her stance, her hands folded on her chest with disapproval. Her glare was fixed heavily on the stranger. This girl is a folder, he sniped at her. Pictures, data sheets, cargo manifests, you name it, it's there. Specifically, all that information seems to indicate that your husband isn't quite so squeaky clean as he's portraying himself to be. Mr. Hemlin didn't move to pick up the folder, staring unblinkingly at the stranger. I don't know what you're talking about. No? I suppose not. Mr. Wesser doesn't make mistakes, but not all of his employees seem to hold his level of perception, sadly. It's possible that they could have mistakenly linked you to someone else's criminal smuggling ring. It's not every day you stumble onto a speakeasy supply house, after all. The man sighed theatrically. Tell me, you wouldn't happen to have a twin, would you? A strong family resemblance between cousins? On top of the folder, the stranger threw down what looked to be a picture, though its subject eluded me from my position. Mr. Hemlin seemed to recognize it, however. He turned his head away from the stranger, lips pursed down and eyes narrowed. The man tried to smile pleasantly, though his general visage ruined the effect. It would be a terrible shame if the police confused you with some other low-life criminal. I'm sure a thorough search of these very facilities wouldn't turn up even a single bottle of brandy, let alone an organized supply of alcohol capable of supplying a speakeasy. Those are prohibited, you know. Mr. Hemlin's shoulders sunk, head hanging heavy in apparent defeat. He seemed to age several years in the span of a few seconds, and the lines on his face deepened, casting a dark shadow on his face. Splendid, the stranger smirked, collecting various paperwork and placing them into his briefcase. Mr. Wesser will be pleased to hear of your assistance. He's promised to forget the debt entirely, as long as you allow him to use your place of business for a few packages every now and again. Otherwise, you won't need to worry about being bothered by me again. The man closed his briefcase, gathering his papers up on his way back around the desk and to the door. He opened it, wrenching it open halfway before he stopped and turned back around. Mr. Wesser will send myself or another associate soon to discuss the full details. But for now, I suppose I will wish you a good day, Mr. Hamlin.